And the nurse was flabbergasted because the man under cardiac arrest, coma, no way he should know that, and he knew everything. Now, I don't call that an anecdote. That was in a study that was basically a prospective study where everybody that had cardiac arrest was brought in. Some of them died. Others may not have been able to be communicated with, but of those, they have beautiful evidence about things like this. And this being is full of exquisite love. They see incredible light. They feel totally at home. That's their word again. I'm home. And then they're told, no, it's not your time. Get back in that body. And they have to do that. But their life, like mine, then is totally transformed. It's literally a 180-degree shift. And in fact, you may know the person, Jeff Kripal, who's been talking about that. He wrote a book called The Flip about people like myself. So if you haven't, I highly recommend his book, The Flip, and all of his research, because literally something happens in us. And we go from this body-mind complex that is full of filtered information, and we only see through the five senses. And then something happens, something is shifted inside of us.
So much to cover there. Okay, so I'll be completely transparent. So I struggle with some of this, right? I mean, I'm an open-minded skeptic. A lot of my guests come on and say totally wild ideas. So I'm not dismissive of anything out of hand. Like leading theoretical physicists are making the wildest and craziest claims about the universe possible. And for some reason, when we kind of give physicists a pass, they're allowed to say nonsense about the universe that makes no sense, about extra dimensions. Yet we hold biology and consciousness to a stricter sort of rule book. So I'm trying to be open-minded about this, but I want to know where the guardrails are. How can we tackle this stuff rigorously? So let's go through this one by one. I definitely want to get to the telepathy tapes later. I've loads of thoughts on that, and I've spoken to a bunch of people on it. I do find it fascinating. I have my concerns, but let's tackle the first one. Let's go to near-death experiences, because I think there is super interesting stuff here. But I want to know, how can it be studied rigorously? Because there's anecdotes galore, right? And anecdotes are not to be dismissed and thrown out. And I think the individual human experience is very important, but it's not data. So I'm curious, how do we tackle these things rigorously? How do we approach them with a real scientific lens? And that doesn't mean materialist and reductionist. It just means rigorous data, experimental, testable claims. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I want to say that, in fact, before I began to look into these things, when I was now a professor and I'd been exploring consciousness for a number of years, I never once looked on PubMed, which is the United States database from scientists on all sorts of scientific phenomena. I never typed in near-death experience to see what was out there. And I would imagine that most of the skeptics have not done that either, because, like me, they do not believe it is possible. So why would I look at an article on NDEs? So when I finally did that, I then discovered that Pim Van Lommel, Bruce Grayson, Sam Parnia, these MDs from universities, for example, University of Virginia with Bruce Grayson, Pim Van Lommel, a network of 10 hospitals in the Netherlands. Sam Parnia is again upstate New York, and maybe now I think at New York University, doing research on near-death experiences. They are doing the gold standard of research on near-death experiences. So I have a hard time when the skeptics say it's only anecdotal. So here's the example. So Pim Van Lommel says, okay, on a particular day, and I think it was maybe like the late 1990s or something like that, they're starting a study in 10 hospitals in the Netherlands. They're bringing in every person that has cardiac arrest into their study. And if they survive, they then ask them afterwards, did anything unusual happen during your cardiac arrest? And they found that something like 25% of the people said, in fact, yes, they did. And then they tell them the story. And then they see if it can be corroborated by this hospital staff that were in the room when they had cardiac arrest. And they find that, in fact, it is corroborated. And I think the one example that Pim Van Lommel gave in this 2001 article was this man that had been found in a field comatose. So he was unconscious. He had been comatose for a while when a passerby found him. They brought him into the hospital. He was still in a coma. They were doing cardiac resuscitation because his heart had stopped. So there was, no EEG in the brain. The heart had been stopped for a long time. They took a long time to begin to get the heart going. And he even says he was aware the entire time, and he was worried they would give up on him. Now, at one point after he was brought into the emergency room, a male nurse discovered that he had dentures, and they needed to take those out so that they could really do putting tubes down his throat and things like that. They took the dentures out. They put them into what they call a crash car. And there they sat. Now, the man then finally recovered after, 90 minutes. And the next few days, he wanted to know, he wanted his dentures back. And so the nurse happens to walk into his room, who took the dentures out, and he said, "You're the one that took out my dentures, and you put them in this crash car." And it showed exactly where it should have been. And the nurse was flabbergasted because the man under cardiac arrest, coma, no way he should know that. And he knew everything. Now, I don't call that an anecdote. That was in a study that was basically a prospective study where everybody that had cardiac arrest was brought in. Some of them died. Others may not have been able to be communicated with, but of those, they have beautiful evidence about things like this. So why are we still saying it's all anecdotal? That's my frustration right now, because Bruce Grayson has done the same thing. Sam Parnia has done the same thing. They have these beautiful examples. So we have these prospective studies. And then on top of that, we have people that weren't in a study. And in fact, I wrote a paper on one woman, Bettina Payton, who is an MD, who had cardiac arrest herself during the birth of her third child. And she was an atheist beforehand. I mean, talking about a complete flip, as Jeff Kripal would say. She was an atheist beforehand, and she was about, in her 20s when this happened. And it was a risky pregnancy. And so they decided to keep her on bed rest beforehand in the hospital, since she worked at the hospital. And then when, in fact, they were trying to do a C-section, what happened is that she basically bled out, and she left her body. And she said all of a sudden, at some point, she's under anesthesia. Her eyes are taped shut to protect her corneas, and she can see into the room. Okay, that should be impossible. And she's an atheist. She sees into the room. She sees the blood dripping down from the IV containers into her body. And she suddenly hears the anesthesiologist say to the surgeon, "How far are you along?" He said, her blood pressure is plummeting fast. She hears all of that. And then suddenly she feels in the center of her chest an emptiness, and she realizes her heart has stopped. Then she sees the man actually going to the wall and hitting this large red button on the wall to call the resuscitation team, and she hears all the monitors going off. At that point, she says, "I realize I'm dying." And she feels herself leaving her body. She says she's going to the back boundaries of her awareness and does this graceful backward arc into the unknown, because she's out. And she says then she actually goes through this incredible barrier into this sparkling black light. And she said suddenly she is feeling totally ecstatic. Everything is fine. And she hears this amazing voice that is full of intelligence and love. And she then hears the voice say, "You must live," in this thunderous sound. And she suddenly feels herself spiraling back down into the hospital room. And then when you read her story, because we've published this in the journal Explore, she then is watching as everybody is trying to get her heart going again. And she even tries to help the people that are putting needles into her elbow, saying, no, go to my wrist, because you're not going to get it in my elbow. The elbow had collapsed. The vein had collapsed. And then finally, this white-haired surgeon comes into the room, weaves his way through all the people, comes to her side, takes his hand, which doesn't even have a glove on it because he's been rushing in, reaches into her blood-filled abdomen, finds the aorta, clamps it shut, and she says that's very painful because she's now back in her body. And in clamping it shut, he gets the blood going again, because that's what all the blood was leaking out. And she then knows that she's going to be living. Now, at that point, another nurse whispers in her ear that the baby has survived and everything's fine. She has a beautiful girl. She then becomes unconscious and wakes up again in the recovery room. Her husband, who's also an MD and an atheist, and all the other nurses and doctors are surrounding her. She has a trachea tube in, so she can't speak. She lifts up her hands so they won't speak and asks for something to write on. They give her a napkin, and she says, "I know I have a baby girl. I know my heart stopped. I know my uterus is out because they had to do a hysterectomy because she wanted them to know before they said anything that she knew everything. And she said from that moment when she came to in the recovery room, she knew consciousness was fundamental. She knew she was not the product of the neurons in her brain in terms of her own awareness. So again, a complete flip. Now, is that an anecdote? All the doctors corroborated everything she had said. So there we have to be careful. I would call that a single case study that was actually carefully researched. And that wasn't within a complete prospective study because not all of those deaths happen in prospective studies during a particular timeline in a particular hospital. But so there's my concern about the skeptics. It's like, just be curious and look at the data carefully. And then talk to the people that are doing the research, the MDs that were skeptics when they started and are no longer skeptics, and say, well, what can we do to make the skeptic actually believe by maybe doing some tests together? Now, I'll also say something to you because the skeptics will then bring this up. They will say, well, we did suggest that they put some numbers way on top of some big piece of equipment at the top of the room. And I think nobody's really seen those numbers in all of these various studies that we've done. And it's like, this is the point that needs to be made about almost all paranormal experiences, meaning not through the five senses. When a person leaves their body or has an experience like that, this is an emotional state for them, and they are focused on things that are emotionally salient for them. They are dying, and they're really interested in things unrelated to numbers that are like a five-digit number on the top of a piece of equipment at the top of the room. They're about to visit their grandmother on the side, or they're actually going down the hall and hearing what their parents have to say because their parents are concerned about the fact that they're dying. So when the skeptic says, excuse me, we're throwing all of that out because they didn't find these five-digit numbers, I'm thinking, are you aware of context? That context is so important. So there is my impassioned plea for the skeptics to be a little bit more curious and open and not just put this out of meaning. And I'll give you one more example. So I was at a conference in Porto, Portugal, put on by the Be All Foundation of end-of-life experiences just in early April. And they decided this year to have people on the stage giving talks that were both the materialists and the post-materialists in the same day. So we had to listen to each other. And so one of the women gets up and is talking about near-death experiences and all of the data that I have just told you about and more. And there's the materialist neuroscientist that doesn't believe in these and says it's all part of the brain dying. And when they get together afterwards and the woman who's given all the evidence for the fact that these appear to be a real credible phenomena talks to the other woman, what does the woman say when she's talking about a particular case that is absolutely shut tight as far as I can say? She's saying, I'm sure they just didn't look at it carefully enough. That was the materialist answer. Well, they just didn't look at it carefully enough because I know it can't be true. And I'm saying, really? What will convince you? I mean, I keep wondering if she were there and looking at all the data herself, would she then be able to believe? So yes, I am passionate about this. What can I say?
No, I find it fascinating. It's super fascinating. And I'm really not dismissive. I think there's something really anomalous going on. I don't have an explanation, right? I'm not willing to say that that is just brain dying, some mixture of hypoxia and chemical reactions. I think that's probably contributory in some way. I don't think we fully understand why, but I think it's probably contributing. But I don't know. I think episode 1 of The Giant Shoulder, I would have been like, I've gone through my own materialist sort of recovering post-materialist. I'm not quite at consciousness as fundamental. I sort of identify as a biopsychist. So I tend to think that consciousness is a property of all biological life. That's where I am at the moment, although I'm getting more radical day by day. And I'm wanting to entertain more of these conversations because you can't just apply our limited view of materialism and reductionism to everything, because that runs straight in the face of so many things that are happening at the moment. I've been having a bunch of conversations about DMT, and you just can't explain that stuff through neurochemistry and through pharmacology. Through common normal neuroscience does not get you there. So you have to entertain these ideas, but you do have to entertain them with, I do think there of course there's a healthy amount of skepticism. One thing and I think your point is also very valid about them not seeing the numbers in the outer body experiences when they're levitating up. I think it's totally fair to say that they're probably not focused on that. And that's actually a reasonable objection. I think it's very clever study design though that they're trying to do, because that's really rigorous, right? If someone can give you the number, it's like that's the kind of science that I think your objection is valid, but I do think that we should be doing more of, because I mean, what the hell is the materialist going to say to that? The person knew that there was a 677 12 feet up on top of the shelf. Like, that would be insane. That would be so cool. And we should
But
be
I
running
bet,
more.
but I bet even if one person found it, they would say, well, that's still an anecdote, because it wasn't 15 people doing it repeated times in laboratory conditions. And I think there is that tension
You'll convince some
between
people,
the
though.
two sides. Yeah. Yeah. And I want to mention one other thing, because I've interacted a lot with Bernardo Kastrup recently, and you probably have had him on your program.
I've
And
been trying. He's been
because
joking my emails. I've been trying.
he's busy. So he
Yeah, he
does
is.
have a wonderful podcast right now, together with a number of people on Tuesdays at my time in the morning. And I have been attending those. And at one point, he and I then had a conversation. When he saw that I was attending, he said, well, Marjorie, let's really have a real conversation, you and me together. And so we did that. And one of the things he said when I was telling him about the near-death experience research, he said, well, I've always tried to find what is the word? An epicycle, a way to explain it by putting another epicycle like they used to do in the mythological ages. That if I do enough things, I can convince myself that it's not real. But he said, when I know that people with an NDE can actually see 360 degrees around them without sight, and that they also can actually talk about something where no other person was present, like they had the NDE in the woods when lightning struck them and they left their body, and they can tell you everything after the fact that was all later corroborated, that it wasn't because they were reading somebody's mind while this was happening, and another person wasn't with them. He said, I have to say that my analytic idealism begins to fall apart. And he said, I then would have to go like to straight idealism. But he said, in other words, naturalism is how he defines his analytic idealism. But he said, psychologically, I can't go there. That bothered me. He said, I would have to give up what I'm doing and become a computer programmer full time if that were true. And that felt angst in my heart. Psychologically, I can't go there. So there's the humor about being a human being. We have certain things that we just don't want to deal with. So
would you mind laying out, Bernardo's amazing. I just finished his book, Analytical Idealism in a Nutshell. Fantastic. Absolutely loved it. Great book. Would you mind laying out analytical idealism as a set of ideas? And then I'm curious how that compares with your current ontology of consciousness. Is it very similar? Is there ways are there places that you diverge? If you wouldn't mind laying that out, because I'm super curious
yeah,
about this.
sure. So for Bernardo's analytic idealism, again, he is saying that consciousness is fundamental, just like me. So we're exactly the same on that. And then what he says is that basically when we take on a body, what happens is that we then are taking on what he would call dissociation from our real identity. So our real identity is infinite awareness. And then you become embodied, and now you identify with the mind-body complex. And so he calls that dissociation. Basically what happens is that we now believe, I believe I'm different from you. I believe I'm different from the other people. And this process then allows us, because of filters on the brain, he believes also in filters on the brain being the main problem that we have, that we are separate. But then he says, he gives this beautiful analogy of people with multiple personality disorder, that basically those people that are, you might call it schizophrenia in a certain sense, they have multiple personalities inside of them. And so they think they're one person one time, one person another, separate. But then when they are, quote unquote, healed by the psychologist or psychiatrist, the therapy, now that dissociation becomes one, and now they are one particular person. And he says it's like what happens is that there were boundaries inside of them that they couldn't really cross before, and they switched from one to another. But then the boundaries become permeable till now all the personalities become one. And then he says what happens to us in meditation or an NDE, whatever these different phenomena, is that the boundaries between us and the rest of the world become permeable. And so we begin to realize, oh my goodness, I'm much more than this individual Marjorie. So that's what he's saying. And I totally agree with them. Whenever I talk about consciousness, I start with Bernardo Kastrup and that whole point of view that we're just seeing through the limited lenses of our five senses. But as he says, those are like the dials in an airplane cockpit that tell you about wind speed and elevation, but they aren't what's really out there. And so he says, when you can get rid of these filters of the five senses and everything else, then you could see much more. So we are right on the same page. The only difference is that he then says he subscribes to naturalism, which is really what I call materialism with a different name, meaning that basically consciousness then in effect basically decided to create this physical reality. And then in doing the creation of physical reality, it starts at the bottom of atoms, and evolution is the primary way that we evolve as human beings, and we work our way up to higher and higher levels of consciousness. But he still has that feeling that the brain is obviously very important, but I don't know that he understands the mechanism either.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel